This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one leader, one country, or one protest. What you are watching form quietly, almost invisibly, is the moment when internal violence begins to trigger external war logic. Not later, not after debate, immediately. For decades, power relied on ambiguity. Say nothing, signal nothing, let repression stay internal. That ambiguity is now gone. A line has been drawn that does not protect borders. It protects bodies. And once a system declares that certain bodies are no longer allowed to be killed without consequence, the system itself changes shape. This is how escalation really begins. Not with bombs, with language, with conditions, with certainty. If you think this is about moral outrage, you'll miss what's actually happening. If you think this ends quickly, you'll misunderstand the danger. Stay with me. Because what comes next is not about intervention. It's about control, and who no longer has it. Power no longer lives where most people think it does. It doesn't sit in speeches. It doesn't sit in uniforms. It doesn't even sit in weapons. It sits in thresholds. For years, the system survived by keeping those thresholds blurry. Violence stayed internal. Responses stayed external. And between the two, delay, deniability. That space is collapsing. What now governs the system is not ideology, or diplomacy, or even strength. It is conditional certainty. A clean equation that removes interpretation. When a system tells another system, if this happens, this follows, it isn't negotiating. It is restructuring behavior in advance. This is not deterrence as theater. This is deterrence as architecture, and architecture changes how every actor moves, especially the ones who used to believe they controlled the rules. Because once thresholds are named, power stops being flexible. It becomes mechanical, and mechanical systems don't pause out of fear. They only respond to pressure, which is already building. This didn't change overnight. That's the most dangerous part. Before, violence inside a system was treated as noise, tragic, condemned, but ultimately absorbed. Before, economic collapse was framed as mismanagement, protests as cycles, crackdowns as inevitabilities. And then, slowly, the framing shifted. Internal actions began to accumulate external weight. Currency failure stopped being local. Labor unrest stopped being domestic. Information control stopped working the way it used to. Nothing dramatic announced the change. No declaration. No treaty. Just normalization. A world where what happens on one street can trigger responses far beyond it. A world where silence is no longer neutral. Where waiting is interpreted as consent. This is how systems fail. Not through shock. Through adjustment. People adapt. Institutions adapt. Thresholds slide. Until one day, everyone realizes the old rules are gone, and no one agreed on the new ones. That realization doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives under pressure, and pressure is no longer theoretical. Then the system tests the line, not symbolically. Physically, force is applied where it has always been applied. Crowds, streets, young bodies mixed with older ones, uniforms advancing, live rounds no longer theoretical. This is where many systems expect the pattern to hold. Suppress, wait, let exhaustion do the work. But something breaks the rhythm. The violence doesn't disappear into darkness. It leaks. Images escape. Counts rise. And suddenly, what was meant to be contained is being measured. Not debated, measured. Numbers change the equation. So does age. So does the visibility of fear on both sides of the line. This moment is not the crisis itself. It is the diagnostic. It reveals whether force still restores order, or whether force now accelerates collapse. And here's the part most systems miscalculate. Once violence becomes legible from the outside, It stops being an internal tool. It becomes a trigger. What happens next doesn't depend on intent. It depends on momentum. Here's what's actually moving beneath the noise. This system doesn't survive on loyalty. It survives on cash flow. Order is purchased. Salaries paid. Equipment maintained. Silence enforced. When money moves, control holds. When it stalls, everything else becomes fragile. Economic failure doesn't just anger people. It rearranges leverage. Currency collapse doesn't stay abstract. It reaches payrolls. It reaches fuel. It reaches the people tasked with enforcing obedience. And there is one sector where that leverage concentrates. One workforce that doesn't need slogans. They just need to stop. When labor withdraws from the engine that funds the system doesn't negotiate. It panics. Because force without funding is noise. And repression without revenue collapses inward. This is why the response isn't reform. It's acceleration. More pressure. More punishment. More urgency. The mechanism is simple. And once seen, impossible to unsee. Which is why the next phase moves faster. Much faster. The response comes faster now. Less messaging. Less patience. More force. Network strain. Commands compress. Decisions are made with less information and more fear. This is what escalation actually looks like. Not speeches. Not announcements. But speed. Communications flicker. Access narrows. Movement becomes harder to track, yet impossible to fully erase. Attempts to seal the system expose its weaknesses. Every shutdown creates a workaround. Every blackout creates proof. And the more pressure applied, the more visible the cracks become. This is the moment when control turns reactive, when authority stops shaping outcomes and starts chasing them. Nothing stabilizes here. Everything accelerates, because the system can't slow down without admitting vulnerability, and it can't speed up without increasing the risk of crossing the line it was warned not to cross. That's the trap. Too much force triggers consequences. Too little force invites collapse. There is no comfortable middle anymore. Only movement. And the people inside the system feel it first. This is where it stops being abstract. Because systems don't absorb pressure. People do. And if you're watching this from the outside, it's easy to think distance protects you. It doesn't. What happens inside a collapsing system doesn't stay there. It changes markets. It changes energy flows. It changes the cost of stability everywhere else. But inside the pressure zone, the consequences are immediate. Daily life narrows. Choices disappear. Risk becomes routine. You feel it in shortages. In uncertainty. In the quiet calculation of whether today is the day something irreversible happens. This is how fear migrates. It leaves the population and moves upward. And once that shift begins, authority behaves differently. More brittle. More aggressive. Less rational. If you think this doesn't touch you, you're relying on the old rules. The ones that assumed internal collapse could be contained. Those rules are gone. Pay attention here. Because what feels distant now is already rewriting the conditions you live under. Pressure never stays local for long. Once information escapes, once markets react, once thresholds are named, the system stops belonging to one place. It becomes shared risk. Allies recalibrate. Institutions hedge. Energy routes start to matter differently. What looked like internal instability begins to distort external planning, not because anyone wants escalation, but because uncertainty is contagious. Every connected system starts asking the same quiet question: what if this doesn't hold? Diplomacy stiffens. Silence becomes signal. Preparation replaces reassurance. And here's the destabilizing part. No one needs to intervene for consequences to spread. They spread automatically. Supply chains tighten. Security assumptions shift. Neutrality becomes harder to maintain. This is how local repression becomes global stress. not through intention, through interdependence. And once the ripple reaches this stage, reversing it requires more than restraint. It requires trust, which is already in short supply, because the system isn't just being tested anymore, it's being watched, and systems under observation behave differently. From here, the system doesn't resolve, it branches. There are 3 paths. None of them are clean. The first is adjustment. Pressure holds just long enough to force behavioral change. Violence pulls back. Controls loosen slightly. The system survives but altered, weaker, more exposed than before. This path depends on discipline, and discipline is already eroding. The second is erosion. Nothing dramatic happens all at once. Instead, capacity drains, money moves slower, orders travel downward with less force, compliance becomes selective. The system keeps standing, but it no longer commands. It manages decline, and then there's rupture. This is the path no one schedules. It arrives when thresholds are crossed too quickly or ignored too long. When force meant to preserve control instead detonates it. When reactions outrun intentions. Rupture doesn't announce itself. It cascades. The danger is not choosing the wrong path. It's pretending choice still exists once momentum takes over. Because by the time the future becomes obvious, it's already locked in, and the final stage is still ahead. This is not the moment people think it is. It's not the end of a regime. It's not the beginning of peace. And it's not a victory for anyone. It's the moment when systems reveal whether they can still bend, or whether they only know how to break. What happens next won't be decided by speeches or statements. It will be decided by restraint under pressure, by whether thresholds hold once they've been named, by whether force is used to buy time or to satisfy fear. History doesn't announce its turning points. It disguises them as management problems, as temporary crises, as something that can be handled later. Later is the illusion that collapses first. If you stop watching now, you miss how this phase actually ends, because the most dangerous part of systemic failure is not the explosion. It's the period when everyone still believes they're in control. Stay with this story. Follow the signals, not the slogans. Because the next chapter won't ask for attention, it will demand it.